Hello and welcome to another program on Law and Order, a program that features a specialist in an area of law and a specialized area of law every week to educate you and bring you information and knowledge on that. Now, all of us have heard about the term missing persons, and since of late, the office relating to looking into the missing persons. An act which was drafted last year, with one amendment this year, Office of Missing Persons Act number 14 of 2016 is giving teeth to all this. So today, because there are a lot of people having different opinions and ideas about that, we thought we will go to the heart of the matter, heart of the issue of why this act came into being and what is missing persons and what is the law relating to it, and bring a specialist and talk about it. And my guest today to talk about the Missing Persons Act is Bhavani Fonseka, attorney at law. She's a specialist in this area and she's going to discuss this with us today. Bhavani, thank you very much for taking time off and coming for Bhavani Law and Order. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Tell me first, people are confused with this act, confusing ideas, different opinions. What is this act all about?
So the whole idea is to bring an independent permanent office to address the issue of missing persons and enforced disappearances. That's the main idea behind this. And several governments, successive governments, have been talking about addressing this issue in terms of getting families of the missing soldiers, disappeared civilians, answers as to what happened to their loved ones. So this has been discussed, and we've had several commissions of inquiry, presidential commissions of inquiry, looking at this issue. But they've also been very specifically for particular time periods. What this office is trying to do, this legislation at least, is to set up one entity which is permanent, which doesn't need to be having extensions. This will be a permanent creation like the Human Rights Commission to investigate and inquire as to what happened to thousands of people who've gone missing, who've been disappeared in Sri Lanka for decades. So it's not a new issue. What's different is that it creates a permanent body. And this legislation was introduced by the government in 2016. It was brought into Parliament. There was a debate, and it was certified last year in August, so nearly a year into it. And last month, the government also brought in an amendment to the law. So now what we have is two laws, the law and its amendment, and we are to see whether the office will be finally set up.
Why do you say is there a problem of creating the office?
So according to the law, the minister has to gazette it. And what we saw last month is, after several months, the president finally issued a gazette saying that the OMP, the Office for Missing Persons, would be under the Ministry for National Reconciliation. Now, after that, there has to be, according to the Act, the OMP Act, the minister in question has to issue a gazette to operationalize it. So the second step hasn't yet taken place, at least as of today morning, we were not aware that this has happened. So that's, I think, the stumbling block. So there are several steps to operationalize it. First is the president indicating under what ministry this is going to be. Second, the minister in question issuing a gazette. Thirdly, the Constitutional Council, and that's also provided in the law, has to nominate 7 persons, provide the names to the president, who then appoints them. So several steps need to be done to actually get this working.
Right. Now, what is the definition of a missing persons?
So the Act actually provides the definition, and it's clearly stipulated, and it's a broad concept. So it's not looking at just the enforced disappeared. It's also missing soldiers, and it's very broad. And in that sense, it will look at cases from Sri Lanka's own history, dating back to the 70s, 80s, as recent as possibly end of the war. And it will affect those in the south, it will affect those in the north, east. So any family member who feel they don't know what happened to loved ones who are disappeared, or a family member of a missing soldier can come before this office and say, we don't know what happened to our loved one. So it's very broadly provided in the Act. It doesn't just cover the war, but any other period. Anyone who feels they don't know about a loved one can come before this office.
Okay. You mentioned repeatedly about 70s and 80s. Does the Act has a limitation that you will be only looking into these disappearances during that time?
No. So that's why I said it's very broad.
Yeah.
The Act doesn't say the office only looks at a very specific period or a specific geographic area. It's really then up to the office to also come up with their own rules and say, look, we are looking at this caseload, and inform the people, because I think a lot of people, as you started, don't know exactly what this is. Would it cover a specific period? The Act doesn't say there are limitations, and that's why I said it's a permanent body that can go on for years, decades possibly, similar to the Human Rights Commission, which started working several years ago. So this can work for several years, depending on the caseload, depending on the speed of investigations. There are no limitations in terms of temporal. What the limitations are is it's for missing and disappeared.
Okay, we'll go to the powers, functions and what comes later, but what I want to ask is this a unique kind of a body only created by Sri Lanka, or have there been similar institutions, or are there similar institutions in other countries which have been torn by wars or civil commotions or anything?
So the issue of enforced disappearances is not a new issue. I mean, across the globe, you have this issue. You see it in Argentina, in Chile, in Peru, several Latin American countries, in this African region, in Asia, for example, in Nepal. So you have several countries across the globe having issues of enforced disappearances, having issues of missing persons. So you have separate bodies similar to the OMP where they've had the mandate to inquire and investigate. But this is very much truth-seeking. This is not a judicial entity. This is not to prosecute anyone. So you've seen across the globe, including in Asia, as I said, Nepal, where you've had entities looking at the issue of missing and disappeared. So it's not a new thing.
Even why a permanent office?
Because we've had several commissions of inquiry. And as I said, we've had the All Island Commission of Inquiry in the 1990s. We've had the Lelasi, we've had the Udalagama Commission, we've had successive commissions. Most recently, we had the Paranagama Commission, which was headed by Justice Paranagama, which looked at the specific issue of missing, and it received over 25,000 complaints from across Sri Lanka. So we had several commissions, and the Presidential Commissions of Inquiry is appointed only for a specific period. Now, what happens to those cases after that specific period is over? And that's why a permanent body can continue. It's not restricted by a time period. It doesn't have to rush through, because Paranagama Commission, we don't actually know what happened to those cases that they investigated. They went across Sri Lanka. I've been to several of their sittings where they had public sittings.
So what happened to these commissions after the investigation? What happened to
their
report?
So the presidential commissions that have been appointed, they give a report to the executive. And we don't know what happens. So the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, LLRC, their report was handed to the government. The report was made public in 2011, and they make a very specific recommendation of having a separate entity looking at the issue of disappearances, because it's such a significant issue in Sri Lanka. So we only know that it goes to the government, the report. What happens after is the question. So in a sense, the Office for Missing Person can go beyond that. It's not just handing a report. It can actually investigate from within.
Right. So I think that's the time I should ask this question. What are the powers and functions of the missing persons? Explain to us. What are the powers? So the powers
are also very clearly stipulated. I would say very broadly, and you have in Section 10, you have the mandate. Then subsequently, Section 12, you have the powers of investigation. So the mandate and the general powers and the powers to investigate provide all of that. So Section 10, 11, 12 clearly stipulates what can be done by the OMP. The main crux of the OMP is that it is to investigate and inquire into what's happened, the fate of a missing person or a person who's disappeared. And through that primary duty of investigating, they have very specific paths provided by the law. So it's to basically very similar to existing entities of taking down complaints, investigating, going into places, working through the magistrates. So for example, they have to go through the magistrate, the police, in terms of very specific powers. But after they collect that basic information, they can share it with the family member who's come before them, and it doesn't have to be a family member per se. It could be even someone who's been following a particular incident and they make the complaint to the OMP. But they can share that information. But any other work that's to be done beyond an investigation will have to be done with the existing criminal justice system. So any prosecution will have to be decided by the Attorney General's Department. The OMP really has very specific functions.
Okay. So as I understand, is that they investigate into a situation. When they want, we'll say, to get evidence or whatever, they use the magistrate courts and the relevant court judicial process in order to get.
No, so they're not restricted by the evidence ordinance. It's it's very similar to the National Human Rights Commission again, which is not restricted by the evidence ordinance. They can have inquiries. Just like a presidential commission, like the Paranagama Commission, the LLRC, they can have public sittings, they can have private sittings, they can have in-camera sittings. So if there is an issue of protection, confidentiality, they can take those steps. That's provided here. What they cannot do is do anything beyond the investigation. That is up to the government, the bureaucracy in question to take it forward.
In order to do an investigation, if they need to summon certain people who are, or find certain information, go into certain books or go into certain material, what is the mechanism they have? Of course, we know we have Right to Information Act. Can they use that act, can an institution like this use that act and get information called for?
So the right to information can apply, but the right to information, even to the OMP, there are restrictions. So in terms of confidential information, it is kept confidential. And the RTI, actually, even the 19th Amendment provides for that, that specific laws can provide for the protection of information in terms of confidentiality. But they can use the RTI. So anyone can use the RTI as long as it's within the...
But some people you think that is necessary for the investigation, summon them, is there power?
They can. And look, it's provided. Just like a commission of inquiry, we've seen this where they can. The only question is, though, if there is a question of information that's confidential, that falls within the RTI Act. So provided by the law, this is not something that we think of or the commissioners can think of. Provided by the law, then there is a question where what information they can get. And if someone goes to the OMP as well and says, we want to share information which is confidential, we want it to be confidential, no one can ask the OMP to disclose that, because that's also provided, that what's shared confidentially cannot be shared in public.
Right. So how can somebody approach this once you say the institution is established? How can somebody make a complaint? What is the process? It is like going to Human Rights Commission, or is it a petition, or is it through attorney, or how?
So we'll have to see when the office is set up what they inform publicly.
So this is not provide the mechanism of filing a complaint?
No.
Who's going to sort out that?
That will have to be the members who are appointed by the president to decide on rules as to what kind of complaint can be made, whether it's a letter, whether people have to come in person, but there's nothing providing restrictions on that. So I think it's up to the 7 members that will be appointed by the president to decide what form. There is also no restriction that the OMP has to be based in Colombo. It can have officers across Sri Lanka. This is something the victims have been calling for, that there has to be officers closer to them. So we'll have to see. So the Human Rights Commission has officers across Sri Lanka. Would the OMP also have officers across Sri Lanka? Would they be able to physically go, or can they send a letter? We'll have to see, but we don't have an office yet to comment on that. and that's to be seen after the members, after it's operationalized, what happens.
Right. Are there any offences that have been described on this Act? Somebody who's withholding information or not coming before commission?
So there can be contempt of court proceedings, like any other entity, including commissions of inquiry, you have contempt of court proceedings. Again, provided by the law, so you can't just willy-nilly go and say someone is guilty of an offence. That's also very specifically provided here, and that also goes through a court process. You know, this is not the OMP that decides there is an offence. There has to be, there is an established process that is being used as it is now, so that also can be exercised when this office is set up.
Right. There's a section called Section 25, and it talks about the protection from action. What does this really mean?
So there's several things that the Act provides. That's again, it's whether someone can challenge an officer of the OMP, a member or a staff member, and there's specific provision provided in the Act that within the realms of their duties, you cannot actually take action. And you also have very specific action, as I mentioned, if there is a contempt of court matter, that also goes through the court. So you actually see this where the Supreme Court and Court of Appeal is mentioned here. That goes through the present court process.
Right. So once we'll say Act is there, the office is established, rules are there, somebody makes a complaint and it goes through the process and they find the reason for the missing person. Then where does that recommendation or report go?
Well, they can make recommendations to the government actors that are in existence or any future mechanism.
Okay.
So, for example,
so far where have they asked them to?
So there is no office for missing person for them to actually make a recommendation. So we don't know where it can go. First, the office needs to be set up.
No, once the office is set up, what I'm asking is once you go through the process, because the Act provides for doing the process, once the office is set up, it's only a mechanism that needs to be set up. The final recommendation of, we'll say, X person's missing person's case, that determination, where does it go for action?
It depends. I mean, we can't speculate as to what the case is.
It's open area.
It says to the government entities. That's why I started by saying if it's a criminal case, if they feel there can be a criminal investigation, if there can be prosecutions, we have the Attorney General's Department. You can send it to them. If there's a case of compensation, they can send it to the relevant authority. So it really depends on the subject matter, the status of a case, and I don't think we should be speculating, but they can send it to any government entity they feel can take action. The OMP cannot take action. They can recommend others to take action.
Right. Now, when we started, we were discussing about this. In the past, there had been several commissions, like not permanent bodies, but several commissions. And we don't know, like you said, where those reports went, right? Now, can't reports from this also end up like that?
Well, this is not going to the executive per se. It goes to very specific government actors.
But if those government actors...
No, I think there is a difference here. The fact that a government entity doesn't act is a large issue of political will, whether the bureaucracy works or not. That shouldn't be the reason not to investigate a case of missing or disappeared. That's a large issue of structural reform that's required in Sri Lanka. So that we don't know. You know, that's again to be tested, whether an OMP can only do certain things, but the rest of the action is up to the government, the entities that are in existence. Whether they'll do that, we don't know. But this is why it's very important to understand the mandate of the OMP is to find out the truth and share that information with families of missing and loved ones, thousands.
Okay, because I'm going to asking you practical examples because people need to know how this works. Otherwise, it is of no use. Because, okay, we'll say the office is established and then you make a complaint. They find that, they find whatever the findings that the reason for this person's missing was so and so or which body or whatever, and then they submit it to, we'll say example, Attorney General. When that happens, are they bound to take action on the report, or can they do their own investigation and find all the evidence or whatever and find that it is not prosecutable or it cannot be taken forward from
So, I mean, Chanke, this is a legal question,
Yes.
no? The evidence ordinance doesn't apply to the OMP.
Yes.
So, to build a case by the Attorney General's Department, the threshold is different.
Yes.
That they would have to decide
Yeah.
if there is enough evidence to prosecute. That's why the OMP cannot say this is a case to prosecute. They can recommend another entity to take action. But I think you're missing the point in terms of when there are thousands of people who don't know what happened to your loved ones. If your family member goes missing, you want to know what happened. That's a very basic fundamental question. That's what the OMP is trying to do, is to give some information, to give the truth, not to go and prosecute someone. They can only recommend someone to prosecute. They can recommend a government entity to compensate. They can recommend a certificate of absence to be issued. The OMP only has a very basic function, and I think that goes to the heart of the misconceptions by many, is that they feel this is also going to prosecute so many. The prosecution is very specifically with the Attorney General's Department. They will have to decide. There may be no cases taken that the OMP cannot
So
decide.
what will be the meaning if somebody gives, again, an example case, they find that the reasons for missing was this, but, so we'll say XYZ person is the reason for missing and they did something, but it goes to the Attorney General or whoever and they don't find evidence now to prosecute. What is the
But that's not the duty of the OMP to prosecute.
So the meaning of the act, it can just end there, no?
So the meaning of the act, the OMP, is to find the truth.
Yeah, so finding the truth and giving, if it is not actionable, does it serve
Well,
the full
it
purpose?
depends. I think you need to understand that families who don't know what happened to loved ones first want to know what happened. The right to know, which is a fundamental right. It's a right to, we know what's happened to various people in our families. Don't you think thousands of people in Sri Lanka, across Sri Lanka, from the south to the north to the east, should have the basic right? That's a human right that everyone should be enjoying.
Okay.
Now, to prosecute is up to a separate entity, and if the government really wants to take that forward, they can.
They can.
It's up to the Attorney General's Department, not the OMP.
Right. Now, you said it is this kind of offices are there in several countries. Has it been successfully done there? And my final question is, coupled with that, is countries where have worse war-torn countries than us, Afghanistan, Iraq in their wars, have they also established mechanisms to do things like that?
So Iraq has at the moment the highest caseload of enforced disappearances.
Right.
Sri Lanka, before the UN working group.
Right.
Sri Lanka is the second highest caseload. Right. Iraq, Afghanistan, there's ongoing hostilities. So it's a different caseload you're looking at, different security situation.
Right.
Sri Lanka, we are in a post-war context where we're looking at reconciliation mechanisms. Now, if you go back to a country like Argentina that I mentioned, that started this whole struggle of enforced disappeared, looking for the answers of the missing, disappeared loved ones, there's been cases. So that's not to say it cannot happen. I think again it comes back to how this office is going to function, what power, what individuals, how it moves forward. But I think we're going way ahead here when there is no office set up yet. The gazette hasn't been issued by the minister. So we come back to the whole thing about when is this going to start? When can people actually go and engage with it? And then make the assessment whether it's successful or not.
Bhavani Fonseka, thank you very much for joining us and those insightful thoughts. It's a rare area, a rare specialized area, and I'm sure people will be educated what is the meaning of the act and where it can take off. And thank you for joining Law and Order and sharing your views. Thank you again.
Thank you.
That's Law and Order for you today. You can join the conversation of Law and Order on our social media websites. That's on Facebook, Facebook/ Law and Order Channel I, and post your comments and your queries on that. And join us next week at the same time for another program on Law and Order. Enjoy the rest of the programming on Channel I. Have a good weekend and good night.